Good morning. With the help of Hashem, we are learning Yerushalmi, Shavis, Pedig Vav, Halacha Aleph. We are in the middle of this fascinating Gemara regarding the boundaries of Eretz Yisrael. We are learning today Daf Mem Hey. We left off on Daf Mem Dalid Amid Bey, 7 lines before the bottom of the Amid, again in the middle of the Braisa. We're in the Braisa of Tchumen. We also learned regarding the gardens of Ashkelon, which implies that the Ashkelon itself is not inside the Tchumen of Eretz Yisrael, and we're speaking about the boundaries that were settled under the leadership of Ezra or by the Oile Bavel. And we began to learn Mipi Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair, number one, that he testified, and he was a Kohen, that Ashkelon, in his times, that means in the times of Bayesheni, did not have the Tumas Eretz Ha'amim, which is why he himself was allowed to go to the marketplaces, even though he had to deal with other types of Tumais that could be resolved by simply going to the mikvah. But Tumais Eretz Ha'amim, that Midrabanan will render a Kohen Tameh, or anyone Tameh, really, Midrabanan, with corpse Tumah, for which they would have to have the Shivasnik, the 7 days, and the Hazos Mechatos. None of that was needed when you went into Ashkelon. And that L'chu'ura would imply that Ashkelon is Eretz Yisrael. But as we will see, Ashkelon is Dafka not Eretz Yisrael. And therefore, what we're up to is another ruling that the Tanoim who gathered there, which was Rabbi Shmuel, Rabbi Yosi, and Ben HaKapor, that they ruled based on the Mipi, Rav Pinchas ben Yair, on his testimony, is that produce that grows in Ashkelon is exempt from Maasros. Like we are mentioning, Ashkelon actually is not part of Eretz Yisrael. Elama, what will become clear is that even though generally the Chachamim did make this Gezeda on Tumais Eretz Ha'amim, certain cities that were mamish adjacent to Eretz Yisrael, as it was then in the times of the second bias, some of them were not included in that Gezeda, as we will see regarding Ashkelon. Now, there's another rabbinic decree. I think we learned about this in Masechtas Pesachim, and that's called Madoir Ha'akum. If Goyim live in a home, there was a concern that if the woman miscarried, she would leave or she would bury her fetus inside the home proper. That also, if the fetus developed 40 days or from the 41st day, that fetus will also give off a Tumas Mace. And therefore, that was the Gezeres Chachamim, that anytime you walk into a home that is inhabited by Goyim, that you become Tameh Midrabanan, it's called Madoir Ha'akum. Now, I want to say two things about this Gezeda. Number one, Madoir Ha'akum is a Gezeda that they only made in Eretz Yisrael. They did not make in Chutz La'aretz. Another big rule about Madoir Ha'akum. Madoir Ha'akum, the tomb of Madoir Ha'akum, is only if the Goy lived there for 40 days or more. Even if there's no female living in the house. There also we say that they were more promiscuous, and they know she doesn't live there officially, but you don't know. And in other words, they have to live there enough time for him to be able to make a woman pregnant and for her to carry it for the full 40 days. From that point on, always their home has this Tumas Madoir Ha'akum. We'll see how that plays into our sugya. Now we're going to go from Ashkelon to discussing Gaza, or what's called today Gaza. Ashkelon, right, as we saw yesterday in the map, is furthermore north than Gaza. That's also southwest, but it's more southwest than Ashkelon proper. And we're going to be going back and forth regarding Gaza, whether it is Eretz Yisrael, in other words, in the boundaries that were settled by Ezra or not. When there's a pasuk in Nehemiah that explicitly writes regarding that when Ezra took possession under Bezman Bayesheni, the entire territory of Yehuda was repossessed by the Yidden. And we know that Ezra is in the territory of Yehuda. It's a great picture. The only problem is you don't have the word Aza, but everyone knows Ashkelon, everyone knows Aza. Aza is just a bit further southwest, because the coast goes on an angle then Ashkelon. And after we conclude the sugya of Asa, we're going to learn in the Gemara something that those of us who learned Rambam learned in the Rambam regarding what Yehoshua did prior to his conquest of Eretz Yisrael, that there were 3 edicts or 3 emissaries that he sent. We'll see what
3 edicts.
Edicts. There was the first, there was the second, there was the third. It was messages that he was sending to the local inhabitants. And as we'll see, that if any of the nations would have agreed to be subservient to the Jewish people, which meant simply pay taxes to the Jewish government, that is ki'ilu, they were conquered. And therefore, their territory would be imbued, bisman bayis rishon, with Kedushas Eretz Yisrael. And we'll see how that's extremely important. However, as we'll see, that's only if they gave in prior to battle. If after a battle they decided to pay taxes, so just the decision to pay taxes in itself isn't going to do it. Here we have a more updated map, and here you can see where Ashkelon is and where Gaza is. Again, they're both on the southern western coast of Eretz Yisrael. And actually, in this picture, you see that the kingdom of Yehuda doesn't go all the way to Gaza. Perhaps there were 2 Gazas, as we will see in our Gemara. It's going to be, again, fascinating. We're learning about the boundaries of Israel. And we're going now to Daf Mem Daled Amud Beis. Guys, L'machar is 7 lines from the bottom. But again, what happened is that 3 Tanoim gathered. This is after the Churban Bayesheni, right? Rabbi Shmuel ben Rabbi Yosi ben HaKapor. And they had a discussion regarding Ashkelon, and based on the testimony of Rav Pinchas ben Yair, that he behaved in a way that he allowed himself to go there, and he was not noyeg the tumas beis hapras midrabanan tumas eretz ha'amim, is a raya that the way it could have been misunderstood that Ashkelon is part of Israel. That's how it could have been misunderstood. However, Lomachar, this is the middle of the Braisa. These same 3 Tanoim got together, and based on the same testimony of Rav Pinchas ben Yair, Nimnu Alel, Lopotram and Amaisers, they paskined that produce that grows in Ashkelon is exempt from Maisers. It was based on that testimony. Why was it based on that testimony? Because what Rav Pinchas ben Yair was saying is that Yidden, including himself, they would go to the Yishmaelis markets of wheat and buy bread from them. That was even on Shvi'is. If Ashkelon would have been part of Eretz Yisrael during the times of the second Beis HaMikdash, then they would not always be able to go there. The fact that he never made a mention, we went there, but only during the 6th of the 7th cycle, that fakir, that's a raya that it's not part of Eretz Yisrael. If it's not part of Eretz Yisrael, then you're not obligated to separate mice. This really, as we develop this sugya and the next Masechtas, we're going to see that midrabanan, certain lands around Eretz Yisrael have rabbinic obligations of tithing, but it's not bothering us right now. Right now, we're leaving that Ashkelon was completely exempted from Maisres. I want you to know that Bachlal, when the Chachamim were Geyser, the Maisres, Midrabanan, a lot of it had to do with Maiser Ani, when they felt that the Aniyim in that locality needed the Maisres, and whenever, for whatever reason, they felt that there is no such a need, they would not make this Gezerah. Now, when they made the second statement, Rabbi Shmuel ben Rabbi Yosi, who was much older than Ben HaKapor, and he would always lean on Ben HaKapor, like we mentioned. The Marafulda says Ben HaKapor is Rabbi Lozer HaKapor. I know there is someone called Bar Kapora. Maybe it's the same, maybe it's not. Ben HaKapor. When they made this ruling, so Mashach Rabbi Shmuel ben Rabbi Yosi Yadov, that he took his hands away from leaning on Ben HaKapor. Prior to that, Shahoya mistamech al Ben HaKapor. And the reason why he stopped leaning on him is because he was not agreeing with what they were saying. And not only that, he was hoping that Ben HaKapor would ask him, why are you no longer leaning on me? Why don't you agree? But no one asked him. So he opened up the conversation, and Amar Loy, and he himself, Rabbi Shmuel ben Rabbi Yosi, he himself said, B'ni, my son, referring to Ben HaKapor, Lama lo yomartoli, why didn't you say that mipnei ma moshachtes yodecha mimeni? Why didn't you ask me that question? You didn't. But let me tell you what I would have answered you. The reason why I stopped leaning on you is because I disagree with your psak din. I would have said that Esmael yesterday, what we also learned yesterday, when they said that Ashkelon doesn't have Tumas Beis Hapras, does not have Tumas Beis Amim, right? I agreed with that. Anihu sheti meisi, anihu sheti harti. In other words, since the tumas beis hapras, tumas beis oamim is midrabanan, so I didn't stop leaning on you, is because something that is only rabbinic, the chachamim have the power to make tar, the chachamim have the power to make tummy. But the achshav ani yomer, but now regarding the obligation of maisres, when we're not talking about a tumah midrabanan, over which we have the power to say yay or nay, because the whole thing is midrabanan. I are of the opinion that Ashkelon was conquered. And now, when was Ashkelon conquered? Bisman by Yisrishoin. Look inside the last Pnei Moshe on the Amud. I hold that anything that grows in Ashkelon has to be tithed. Why? Not because I hold that under the leadership of Ezra it was resettled. I know it wasn't resettled. I don't think it makes a difference. Because Rabbi Shmuel ben Rabbi Yossi was of the opinion that Kedusha Rishoina, that's the Kedusha of Yehoshua, the Kibush, is Kedusha Rishoina, Kitchel Shaita vi Kitchel Asalavi. Look inside the Pnei Moshe. I hold that it's Chayv in Maisres. Ukahai Manda Amar Af Al Gav Shaloi Kivshua Oile Bavel. Yeah, no one is debating in the Mitzias that Ashkelon remained a predominantly non-Jewish city. And it wasn't settled under Ezra. Nevertheless, he held, Rabbi Shmuel ben Rabbi Yossi holds, Kedusha Rishoina Kitchel Shaita v'Kitchel Asalavi. And therefore, I don't agree when it comes to Maisres, for sure you have to be Machmer. When it comes to Tum and Tara, I was going along with you. Daf Mem Hey. V'heichani poiter midvar Torah. Okay, but Chevra, there were 3 Tanoim, and you go after the majority. That means that the Rebbe and Ben HaKapor, who said that produce that grows in Ashkelon does not need to be tithed, they must hold that it's Vadai Chutz La'aretz. If they would even have a suffix in a Doiraisa, they wouldn't say it. Gewaldik. And the Chiddush is that even though it's Vadai Chutz La'aretz, they hold that there isn't the Tumas of Eretz Amim. Okay, now the Gemara has another kash, or the Gemara wants to clarify something. Now, like we mentioned in the words of introduction, that Tumas Madoir Ha'akum was only decreed on a dwelling place of a goy that is in Eretz Yisrael. If you are outside Eretz Yisrael, then there's no Madoir Ha'akum. Prior to their convening and paskening that there's no Tumas Eretz Ha'amim, many people held Ashkelon is in Eretz Yisrael, which means it's subject to Madoir Ha'akum. So now, says the Gemara, now that we said that there isn't Tumas Gush, if there isn't Tumas Gush, even though it's Chutz La'aretz, now we're going to say if there isn't Tumas Eretz Amim, now there's going to be the Madoir Ha'akum, because that's the way it works in Eretz Yisrael. Eretz Yisrael has no Tumah, God forbid, it's the Holy Land. We demarked our graves properly. And that is wherever there is no Tumas Gush Eretz Amim, you have the Gezerah of Madoir Ha'akum. So when they were Nimnu v'Gamru, including with Rabbi Shmuel ben Rabbi Yossi, who agreed that there is no Tumas Gush, there's no Tumas Eretz Amim, which means now Madoir Ha'akum is applicable. So now he had a kasha. Is it retroactive? Is it only going forward? What do I mean by retroactive? Like we mentioned, that Madoir Ha'akum means that in the boundaries where there's no Tumas Eretz Amim, which generally is Eretz Yisrael, if a guy moves in today, I'm allowed to go into the home. I don't become Tamei Midrabanan, maybe there's a fetus buried there. It only begins 40 days after he moved in. Ashkelon Goyim already lived there for more than 40 days. They lived there for many years. But people did not know that it's tahar from Gush Eretz Amim. So now when they paskin that it's tahar, so now the question is, from when? Is it retroactive? Or is it only Mikano Lahaba? So Rab Simon says it's only Mikano Lahaba. That since until that point, they viewed, before the 3 Tanoim, that Ashkelon is Chutz La'aretz. It's Tamei Mishum Gush. Tamei Mishum Gush, there was never a problem with Madoir. Never a problem with Madoir. Now that you're making it a problem with Madoir, so now you have to wait 40 days. Once they made that declaration, now wait 40 days, and only afterwards are you going to have the Tuma of Madoir Ha'akum. That is what Rab Simon says. And Rabbi Yirmiyah disagreed, because he hold that when they got together, the 3 Tanoim, they weren't creating a new din. They were being Megala, they were clarifying what the din was all along. Pinchas ben Yair was way before them. And based on his testimony, they knew that it never had Tumah. It never had Tumah. If it never had Tumah's gush, that means it always had Tumah's mother. So Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah, v'loy b'to'os anu machzikim. No, they didn't say that there wasn't a change of status. They clarified what always was. And therefore, the moment these three got together and they said that, now that they were megala, that Ashkelon is not Tameh, if it's not Tameh because of Gush, automatically the other rabbinic gezerah of Madura Akum was always in place. Now, of course, if a guy only lived there less than 40 days, it's not going to be Tameh. But all of the houses of the Akum that were there for more than 40 days, from that moment on, if a Jew would have walked in there, he would have acquired the Tumah. Amar Rav Manan says the Gemara, B'chlal, the second topic of whether there's a chiyuv of maasros, that's one thing. But the first nimnu v'gamru, the first nimnu was that, I'm taking back, the first thing that we learned today, they got together and they decided that Ashkelon is pater min maasros. Of course. Why of course? Because the Braisa of Tchumen was already by us before these three Tanoim got together. And in the Braisa of Tchumen, even though, like I mentioned yesterday, there's a lot of discussion what many of the names mean. But Ganya, the Ashkelon, means the gardens of Ashkelon. The gardens of Ashkelon are north of Ashkelon. And since the Braisa puts at the southern western boundary the gardens of Ashkelon, that implies that anything further south is Chutz La'aretz from the times of Ezra. So, fragt die Gemara, Amar Rav Mana, why did they have to take account to say it's exempt from maasros, which basically means it's Chutz La'aretz? Because if it would have been even like we mentioned today, even if it's a suffix Eretz Yisrael, there would be a chiyuv to give it. Lo yichein Amar Rabbi Yaakov bar Acha b'shem Rabbi Zeira min man detani, from the fact that in the Braisa of Tchumen, the southernmost boundary or border is Ganya da Ashkelon, and Ashkelon is further south. If Ganya da Ashkelon is the end of the Holy Land, Bisman Bayesheni, which means basically until Mashiach, I'm gonna make a comment on that. Hada Amra Ashkelon kelachutz. So why did we even need them? I just want to say one thing over here. I'm not saying this is our opinion, but the fact that the settlement of Ezra was done with the permission of the Goyim, that could have some halachic effect, Danny, regarding today's settlement in the Holy Land, when there was the agreement, whether you call this the Balfour Declaration, this whole topic of how B'chlal did the Yidden establish a state, when we have the Gemara in Ksubas, the Shalish Shvuos, the most important approach to that is that from Agadata, you can't ask questions on halacha. That's the most important thing to understand. This Agadata is written nowhere. But even if you want to address the Agadata, Shalayalu b'chayma, I think that's the words of the Shvuah. Shalayalu b'chayma means to go against to take it by force. And that's in this concept of taking it by force, which is Yeshua, which is a lot more powerful, but we swore not to do that, versus taking it without force, taking it b'reshus, has a lot of historic and halachic credibility. But coming back over here. Okay, so now the Gemara says, you're wrong. From the Braisa of Tchumen itself, we would not have known whether Ashkelon is obligated or exempt from maasros. Why is that? Because, I'll tell you, V'chitzur einoi asur leilach l'sham. Of course, you have to take account. Is there a prohibition for a kohen to go to tzur? And the answer is no, that a kohen is not prohibited to go to tzur. Now, Danny, what does that prove? And one thing is for sure, guys. We know that tzur, that which grows in tzur, does not have to be tithed. So we already see that there can be a land that fakir. He is mischayev. Why is he mischayev? He's mischayev, my friends. First of all, tzur is not Israel. Nevertheless, here we also see that a kohen, a kohen cannot go to tzur. If Kohen cannot go to, why can he not go to Tzur? Because the Gush. Gush means Chutz La'aretz. On the other hand, even though it's Chutz La'aretz, you have a Kohen Hasham, Ein Mischayev, you are Mischayev. Why are you Mischayev? Because the lands near Eretz Yisrael have either some Chiyuvim of Maises, guys, remember with these words, or all of the Chiyuvim of Maises. And why would that be? That would be because the Iker was about to pour. So you see that there's a Chiyuv Midrabanan. Only having the Brais of Tchumen, yes, you know that Ashkelon is Chutz La'aretz, but one might have thought that at least Midrabanan you're Chayev. Lefikach nimnu alel lepatrem eramaitzes completely. And the reason why the Chachamim would fully exempt it is because they were very much in touch with the actual mitzias of the poor. And if they felt that the poor in Ashkelon don't need to have the local maiser ani, they would not be goized the midrabanan trumas u'maisers. This is something that we'll learn a lot about later. We're going to see, like I already mentioned, about Syria. That Syria is like this in between the Holy Land and outside the Holy Land, right? We already learned this many times about the Kibush Yachid. We're going to get to that in the next sugya, but let's keep on going. Right now, Ashkelon is not. Ashkelon is for sure not in, and not only that, you don't. But even midrabanan, you don't have to give maisos. The only sheet
but it's not. It doesn't have the tumah of gush.
Doesn't have tumah of gush also, and then we also learned that according to Rabbi Shmuel ben Rabbi Yosi, it's a machlekes tanoim. According to those who hold, and it's a machlekes hamirayim, and it's a machlekes and halacha. That kedusha d'shayna, then Ashkelon had kedusha b'zman bayisheni. Very simple, and that's why it didn't bother him. It had no tumas gush because it was the Holy Land.
I think most people don't pass in that way.
That's correct. Rab Simon v'Rababo Chavedaf Mem Hey Yomid Beis Ava Yisivin. They were sitting. Now we don't know who was the one who was asking, who was the one that was answering, but the Gemara is going to record the back and forth that they had amongst each other. So one of them said regarding Aza, guys, just to know, you know how much tzaras the Jewish people historically had from Aza? I'm not only talking about what happened to Shimshon. I'm talking about even relatively recently, the main right-hand man of Shabtai Tzvi was from Aza. Aza was a place that we had a lot of suffering. Nathan of Aza. That who told me that? My Rosh Yeshiva, Rabbi Leib Shlita. Always tzaras from Aza. I said, well, I knew Shimshon. He says, nah, Shabtai Tzvi, nothing. Yeah. Right. So now 1 second. Now, guys, there is a pasuk that the Yerushalmi is not even bringing. And that we have to know by heart. The pasuk in the Chemya, the Gemara is not going to quote it. There's a pasuk in the Chemya that says that regarding the settlement, Bisman, Ezra, that all of the cities that were part of Yehuda were resettled. Now we need to know if Aza was part of the territory of Yehuda. So the map that Kevin found, who knows where, and he put it up on the Zoom, did not have Aza all a part of the territory of Yehuda. Well, hold on. Problem is, now we're going to Shoiftim, guys, don't get confused. Shoiftim is bias Rishon, right? Of course. So it says in Shoiftim, Val Yilkot Yehuda es Azav es Gevula. Based on the Gemara's assumption that we know, now we know that what? That we have a pasuk in Nehemiah that says that under the second entry, under Ezra, we settled in all of the territory that God Almighty gave to the Shevet of Yehuda. And now we know from Shoiftim that Yehuda had in its territory Azav es Gevula. Now we got a problem. And like I mentioned, so many steps are left for our understanding by ourselves. If Ashkelon, now that we established Ashkelon is Chutz La'aretz, because the territory of Eretz Yisrael on the southern western border, Bisman Ezra, which means during the entire time of Bayesheni, went until the gardens of Ashkelon, and we already said Ashkelon is further south, is a Chavade Aza is even more south. So it doesn't fit. L'chura, we did settle Aza. So the Gemara gives a Gavaldic answer. Leisei Aza, which means there are two Azas. What do you think? Just because it's the same name? And let me go back to the Brais of Tchumen that we read of like Ashrei yesterday. There are many names that even if you recognize the name, it doesn't mean that's one approach in the Gemara. That's these two Amiroim speaking to each other. So there was an Asa that's in the Chelik of Yehuda. And yes, that was resettled, the Pasuk in the Nehemiah. And the Asa that you are talking about, that we are talking about, that Asa was never part of Tchumei Eretz Yisrael. So now these two, let's go to Absim and Ababo. So now the first one says, well, hold on. When it says in Shoiftim, Ves Ashkelon Ves Gevula, again, that's the pasuk which is writing the names of the cities that were part of Shevet Yehuda. So are you telling me again, same kasha, right? It says Ashkelon. It says in Nehemiah that Ezra settled all of the cities that were in the chelik of Yehuda. So again, how can the Brais of Tchumen imply that Ashkelon is Chutz La'aretz? Why? It was settled by Ezra. There was a chazaka. Answers the Gemara the same answer, that there are two Ashkelons. Just because there's one Ashkelon, there's another Ashkelon. Let's say Ashkelon. Oh, so if that's the case, now we're going back. Whoever still remembers Halacha Aleph of this Perek in Shvi'is, when the Mishnah was speaking about, if you remember, the Shalosh Adotzos. So we had like this. We had that the lands that had the Kedusha Bisman Ezra. So Shvi'is means Midoiraisa, which means not only can you not work the land, but you are subject to the laws of Biur. Then the Mishnah gave you the territories, including the Mishnah spoke about Nachal Mitzrayim. Nachal Mitzrayim, if you can put up a map, Kevan, it's a physical Nachal that separates Eretz Yisrael from Eretz Mitzrayim. It's way down in the south. Now, and the Mishnah was saying that the territories that were beyond Oile Bavel, but they were part of Oile Mitzrayim, Midrabanan, you're not allowed to work the land. In other words, then, produce that grows on Shvi'is there is not subject to Biur. That's what the Mishnah said. So once you're telling me, Azah, there were two Azahs. Ashkelon, the two Ashkelons. Will you say the same thing by Nachal Mitzrayim? And the Gemara, for some reason, takes it as a given that this Vadai Loi, don't come and tell me that every single city that you read, there were two of them. Now, what's a lot more common is that when you have a city like Yericho, just as an example, the city Yericho now is in its close proximity. It's not that there are two Yerichos, it's that over many, many, many years, some parts of the cities, deteriorated, and when it was rebuilt, the Nivna Soha'id Altila, that's with Mashiach, not everything is exactly Altila. So the outskirt became the main street. That could be. So it's a little bit off. That's another topic. Doesn't have to be exactly b'diyuk where it is right now. But when the Amoida was saying Leisei Aza or Leisei Ashkelon, what he was saying is that one Aza is in one place and the other Aza can be many, many miles away. And he's rejecting it. He's saying that just like on Nachal Mitzrayim, there's only one Nachal Mitzrayim. There has to be one Aza and one Ashkelon. It can be a little bit ahead, a little bit ahin. It's not completely in different locations. Now we have a problem, Danny. The problem is, again, it says in Nehemiah, it's amazing how much in the Gemara is not written. I state in Nehemiah that under Ezra, we reconquered all of the territories that were settled by Yehuda. And the answer for that is, that the Noise Kalim over here say, is that it doesn't have to mean that there weren't exceptions. There can be exceptions. And the exception is that on the southern western coast, I'm going to go with the concept that it was very valuable territory, and therefore the Persian monarchy under whom we resettled the land did not give us permission to officially take over those parts.
Based on this answer, there's not two Azaz, there's not two Ashkelon, there's just one.
And there was an exception. In other words, what the Gemara is,
he got most of the
he got generally he got what he got. And when it came, I think it's about the coastal cities. The coastal cities, and we had this clearly by Kesaria, Kesarin. Part of it is, part of it isn't. Till today, when we learned that then, Kesarin is very expensive real estate now in the Holy Land. It's a very chashuva place to live in. And you can see there's a lot of remnants of the Roman buildings over there. In other words, it would make sense that when it comes to the real
isn't that part of the trade route? Like that's
that Vlad is saying very good. You have to know where the highway. That's a very good point, because if the highways,
the ships pulled in there, those were the ports.
Very good. The ports and the highways, they never gave it to us. It's not theirs to give to us, but now we are acknowledging that Bisman Bayesheni was like a Golus time. Look, we learned Amaraful that we don't even count the Bayesheni sometimes. Can you imagine? It was a Golus. It was just an inspiring concept for us to know that in the future we're going to get it back. But the real future, is Mashiach Tzidkenu. Let's go weiter. Omar Rabbi Shua ben Levi. Guys, we have a lot more. We have a lot more over here about Azza. And it's amazing. And maybe what's happening now will shed some light to the Gemara's ultimately remaining with a question mark. But let's go weiter. Amar Rabbi Shua ben Levi. Ksiv says, we're quoting a pasuk in Shoiftim, that Vayivrach Yiftach. Guys, we're speaking now about Bayis Rishon, so don't get confused. Mipi Echov, Vayeshev Eretz Toiv. Vayeshev Eretz Toiv. And I'm reading in Torah Oyer HaShalom, the continuation of the pasuk. Vayislaktu El Yiftach Anoshim Reikim. And who gathered around Yiftach? Pusta people, empty, airhead people. Vayetzu Imoi. So what's Eretz Toiv? So it says the Gemara, you know what Toiv is? Zu Su Sisa. I don't know what Su Sisa is in today. However, one thing is clear, that we're speaking about the north of Eretz Yisrael. We're speaking now, Chevra, about southeast, Danny. Southeast, not southwest. We're going to southeast. And he settled over there. If it's Kinneret, then it's in the north. But we be that as it may. This is a very big statement. He settled in the land of Toiv. Why Toiv? Shapatim and Amaistas. Which means Chutz La'aretz. Why would you say Eretz Toiv is Chutz La'aretz? Chava Shomati, I wish I can quote B'Shem Amroi, but this is something that I heard, that Bechlal, the Holy Land, is called Eretz Toiva. Eretz Toiva Urechava, always. Toiv Onahei. Hey are the 5 obligations that are Noyig Be'eretz Yisrael. Trumos, Maisres, Chala, Bikurim, Shvis. So one of the ways we describe a land that is not mamish good, that's lacking from its good, Chutz La'aretz. So he settled, and that makes, so he settled the Eretz Toiv. So now, Rav Imi Boye, why was it Chutz La'aretz? Why are they parted from? How can you tell me that Toiv means Supatim and Amaisres? Weren't the inhabitants of Sisin, guys, Shoiftim is Bayis Rishon? Did they not acquiesce? Did they not agree to pay tax to the Jewish people then? And what's the kasha? The way you define kibush, which is what imbued Eretz Yisrael with the kedusha, from which stems the chayuvim of trumas, maisres, and chalan, bikurim, and shvius, is not only if Yeshua with his armies conquered the city, but if they agree to pay taxes, that's called they were conquered. And it's a fact, right, Rabbi Mendel? They pay taxes. In other words, the Gemara is explaining the premise of Rav Imi's kasha. What does taxes have to do with everything? We who learn Rambam, we learned this. Now you know the source, because we did not learn this in the Bavli. That the Rambam Shita, that even by the Shiva Samamim, when Hashem says Lo Yisechaya Kol Neshama, it was not a gezeda of what they call today genocide. It was not that. Is that if they remain there and they fight Lo Yisechaya Kol Neshama, but they had 2 opportunities to run away, and Bachlal every time, that's what we learned in the Rambam is mamash over here. So Rav Imi Commission is Kafshud Rav Imi, who knew that the people that lived in the city of Sisin, they agreed to pay tax. His kasha is based on the premise, since they agreed, so they were conquered by Yeshua, and therefore it should have kedusha. And therefore, if it has kedusha, that it's Yisrael, why would they exempt from Maisres? How can you explain the words toiv as they are puturim and amaisis? Shalosh peras tigiyos. Now, peras tigiyos either means, as the Gabbai corrected, edict, not edict. You have to shrei, because it has to go into the brain. Or it means three messengers that Rambam writes, he sent shluchim. That means prior to entering any city in Eretz Yisrael, shliach number 1 told him, shliach Eretz Yisrael. Actually, consul Eretz. Before we enter the land, number 1 is Mishu Reitzeli Panis Yifana. You want to lead, you want to run away, we're going to let you run away. We're not going to kill you. Now, whoever ran away, ran away. Now, then the next edict was those who did not run away. So the next edict was, you're staying in your home? Okay. Become subservient to the Jewish government, expressed by not national service. We don't trust them to join national service, to pay taxes. Lahashlim. And if you're going to be mashlim, if you're going to pay taxes, we will not engage in battle with you. We will allow you to stay in your homes. And then the third edict was lasis mochama yas. And what actually happened? So when we went to the territory of what used to be Eretz HaGirgashi, all of the Girgashites, they left. Pina, And God rewarded them. That where did they all collectively end up settling in? They ended up settling in Tunisia. And as we'll see over here, I know that we call it Afriki, but we know that they settled in Tunisia. That Afriki, the topography of Tunisia, is very similar to the Holy Land. And that was good. It means when you move locations, it's very helpful, especially when people are in the age of myself, right? You're not that adventurous in the way you're not going to move from a cold climate to a hot climate. Your body is not used to it. You acclimate a lot better if you have to move to a place that you're familiar with already. So since the Girgashi Pina Vehem and Loy HaKadosh Baruch Hu, it's interesting. Vehem and Loy means that they left because they believed that God gave it to the Jewish people. Why would they leave? And because of that, so it's really because they believed in God Almighty. They went to Afriki, and he writes in the bottom, they settled in Tunisia. So it's interesting that Tunisians are descendants from the Girgashites. And that was a blessing for them. And how do we know that God reward? In other words, Bahashgacha Pratis, they settled in a place that was good as a reward for their emunah in HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So we're quoting a pasuk in Malachim. That pasuk in Malachim is actually a threat that Sancheriv gave after he exiled the 10 Shvatim. After 10 years, after 10 Shvatim were exiled, he wanted to conquer the rest of Israel. But he was trying to get us to leave on our own volition. So he was bribing us. And he was telling us that if you're going to, won't make a fuss, and you'll relocate, so what will happen? I will take you to a land that just like Eretz Yisrael. That's a pasuk in Malachim. That ad boi v'lokachti yaschem, without a fight, el Eretz ka'artzechem, I'll take you to a country that the Begashmi is similar to the Holy Land. And we know that this refers to Afriki. So that's from where you see that Afriki, again referring to the north of Africa, is the same topography like the Holy Land. So that's the Girgashim. Now, the next nation was the Gevanim. Now, guys, I want you to know that the Gevanim are the Chivis. The Chivis, Hishlimu. First of all, they tricked us, but at the end, we made an agreement with them. As it says, V'chi Hishlimu, Yoshve given as Israel. Clearly, you see that they made a pasuk, that they agreed to pay us taxes. Actually, we converted them. But that's a whole story that we'll get to another time, and ultimately, they were designated to be the water carriers and the wood choppers. Or maybe I got the order wrong. Which one does the pasuk say first? And it's of him? Okay, right. Now the other 31, Shloishim Echad Melech, Asam Muhammad ben Aful. Bottom line is that we see that they were given an option to stay and to be mashlim paying taxes, and that's called conquered. So we're back to the kasha. The kasha is why are you telling me? Rav Imi is asking, how can you teach that Yiftach went El Eretz Toiv, and Eretz Toiv means Shapatim and Amaisris? How can that be when that city, they pay taxes? Again, Yerushalmi, the Gemara doesn't give an answer. But what the Noisei Kalim suggests as an answer is that if they would agree to have, those who agreed, like the Gevonim, to pay tax prior to the battle, prior to our entry, that's called kibush. But those who did not agree to pay taxes at that moment of the edict or of the shliach, they agreed at a later point, that's not enough of kibush. That would be one way of keeping the perush of the pasuk in Shoftim that Yiftach settled the Eretz Toiv, which means he settled in a place that is chutz la'aretz, and that is Susisa. That's Patim and Amaisres. The Bnei Susisa pay taxes at the time of Yiftach could be, but under Yeshua they did not agree. They were not mashlim. And the only way then to imbue it with Kedusha would be to push it, conquer it. And that never happened over there. Okay. Now, let's go weiter. We want to know regarding other lands. Let's see how far we can get. Frag the Gemara. Mepnei ma lo gozru al oisa haravach shebegir rikoi. Now, there's open land. Revach means it was an open piece of land. Gererikoi is Gerar. Gerar, I want you to know, is near Be'er Sheva, that we have in the Chumash. Why did we not decree on the area of the open area of Gerar? Why was it not declared for that Tumas Gush when it's outside Eretz Yisrael? Why is it outside Eretz Yisrael? Guys, everything began yesterday with the Braisa of Tchumen. Gerar is furthermore south than Ashkelon. So just like we had a question regarding Gaza seemingly was outside, Bisman Bayesheni. Same thing is going to be with Gereriroi, or Gerar. So l'cha'ira, since it's outside the boundaries of the Brais of Tchumen, why does it not have Tumas Gush Eretz Amim? So answers the Gemara. Reb Simon B'Shem Reb Shlomo Levi answers. I'll tell you why. Because it's very unpleasant to live there. Maybe there's many mosquitoes. Maybe it's very humid. I don't know how it's unpleasant. But where did Chazal make the Gezerah of Tumas Gush or Tumas Eretz Amim? Only where people would live. If a place to begin with is not that inhabitable, they never bothered to make the Gezerah. Now the Gemara wants to know, okay, Ad Heichon, if you're going from Gerar and you're going south until where, even though it's Bisman Bayesheni, Chutz La'aretz, did it not have this Gezerah of Tumas Eretz Amim? So Rav Chanan B'Shem Rabbi Shmuel Barav Nachman, that status goes until Nachal Mitzrayim. However, after Nachal Mitzrayim, guys, listen, even though it's still unpleasant, well, you think it's pleasant to live over there in the desert? We all went to Chevra. Even though it's unpleasant to be there, nevertheless, at some point, the Chachamim said, Tumas Eretz Amim. Now, final, that's one more shtickle. What about Aza? V'harei Aza nin v'yafem. But is it not pleasant to live in Aza? So, l'cha'ira, we already established that Aza is not Eretz Yisrael, Bisman Bayesheni. However, it's a given that the Gezerah of Tumas Eretz Amim did not go to Aza. There's no Tumah there. And we're saying, where they didn't give the Tumah. They didn't give the Tumah where it was unpleasant to live. So now, but Aza is pleasant to live. The Aza that was pleasant to live, my friends, is Gush Katif, just to make it clear. Not the Aza that you're looking at back right now. So the Gemara says, Pishpisha. Now, Pishpisha, according to the Maraful, the Shem Chacham. We're learning new names of Amoraim that we have only in the Yerushalmi. Pishpisha, Omar, Kumi Rabbi Yosi, She'elis le Rav Acha. I asked Rav Acha whether Kahanim can go to Aza, Bisman Bayesheni. He's not giving an answer. He's saying a fact. And you should know, Ushram, they did not give it to Tumas Eretz Amim. Why did they not give it to Tumas Eretz Amim? Maybe it has to do with their Ruach HaKodesh about the events right now. Who knows? Maybe Al Shem Ha'asid.
So what does that mean?
I'm curious.
But it is.
I'm curious to know. It's not Tommy. Maybe finally when we're conquering it, right? We're learning this Chavra in the month of Iyar, Tavshin Pehei. We're conquering it, we're giving it back. No nation in the world ever did such a thing. We're conquering it, we're giving it back. We're conquering, giving it. Maybe we're going to conquer it and keep it. Maybe that will be kibush. I'm curious. And if it's kibush, then they'll have kedushas Eretz Yisrael. Maybe they saw something about Aza. They didn't want to make it fully chutz la'aretz. Even Bisman, Bayesheni, they did not make it fully chutz la'aretz. V'haraya, it's pleasant to live there, and it's doesn't have too much Eretz. Maybe they wanted to motivate people to settle there. If you have a better answer, tell me. I know we didn't turn the Amid yet, but we'll stop over here to be continued. We got a lot more to go on this.